All right. Well, now we're all introduced. Welcome. Our topic here is leadership crisis and what we might do in response or need to be thinking about. So who wants to go first? Who's got a thought for us to bat around? You're all too polite. I should have picked someone, shouldn't I? Yeah, I know Will can talk off the top of his head. So Will, go. Off you go.
Oh, thanks, Jace. Sort of been doing quite a lot of leadership development work in the ministry and higher education academic space, and that's yielding some interesting thoughts. I've been working with Chris on some of that work, and I think if I had to just think about one single thing, it would be around, in a ministry sense, the spiritual formation of a leader. In a sort of more sort of non-ministry secular sense, if you want to use those words, the sense that many people are sort of being promoted into leadership roles or occupying leadership roles, and the amount of leadership development and understanding that they actually have in a formal sense is a fraction of what they have had if they're an academic in terms of developing their sort of subject knowledge and expertise, or if they're a minister in terms of how much time they might have spent learning to preach or study the Bible and other bits and pieces. So I think there's a little bit of a sort of gap between the sort of role and the position that people have and the journey that they've been on in terms of their sort of self-awareness and leadership development. So that would be an area I'd like to unpack a little bit more, and there's some frameworks and models and some experiences that would feed into that. But that would be my starter for 10.
Any proposal for what we should be having a run at for that gap?
From me?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So some of the things that seems to be really hitting home in the ministry space is the critical journey stages of faith model. And the sense that in evangelical and Pentecostal sort of settings, we often think that there are only 3 stages of faith: getting to know God, discipleship and learning, and then activity and productivity. Janet Hagberry and Bob Gulick developed this sort of critical journey model where there's a stage 4, 5, and 6. Stage 4 is the wall and the inner journey, and then stage 5 is the outward journey, and stage 6 is the stage of love. And that was based on Janet Hagberry's previous book that was a leadership book, and that leadership book talks about exactly the same sort of process, but the process of us as leaders moving from powering organisations from the external sense and moving through to that sort of more internal understanding of who we are as leaders. And I think one of the things that Chris and I have really focused on in our work for Advance HE is around that sense of self-awareness of the leader and that need for the leader to understand sort of what's motivating them and to deal with some of the shadow side, some of the sort of, we often talk about the leader shift and the shift from ego to eco, and sort of playing on the fact that many leaders that we encounter don't understand the sort of rich development of leadership ideas and leadership theory, and things like hero and messiah and charismatic and great man are still quite predominant. You know, even in our ministry settings, Moses is often quoted to me as the leadership model. That sort of, I am the man of God, I hear from God, and the congregation look to me and I need to role model that. And in that role modeling, we tend to get a disconnect between authenticity, that sense of, again, sort of in a recent leadership development for academic leaders, sort of we brought this idea of this hypocrites, this wearing a mask, this sort of hypocrite sort of element from the Greek of playing a part, and that sense of the disconnect that can occur then.
Brilliant. Thank you. Saying some nodding. What's that prompting amongst you?
I think it prompts for me some of the conversations that Will and I have been having. And it's the question for me is then, what is the real work of leadership? And I think that question has led me to a quest of what is the leadership mandate for this time? And is it the same as what it has been, or is it something different? And I read a book last summer. I try to read things outside my normal sphere of, I'm a social scientist, so I try and disrupt myself. So I disrupted myself with a book by Makoto Fujimura, which is called Art and Faith. And N.T. Wright did the foreword for that. And it profoundly impacted me, because when I ask that question, what is the real work of leadership? As people that love the Lord and live a life of faith, we must ask ourselves, we are made in his image, which means we are creators. So I think for me, when I look at this season and time that we're in, it's the, Mark Sayers, the gray zone. And I think for me, this specific in-between era tells me that we can no longer, as leaders, be fixated on fixing, which leads to this fixed mindset. So I think it's not that fixing in its entirety that is wrong, but let's be real, the challenges that we face cannot be fixed. Jason, in your article, you talked about this global mood disorder. That's fixable in that sense of like black and white blueprint way. And I think when I read Mako's book, he offered a proposition to me. He says, so what are we making? And I wonder, as a leadership scholar and someone that is practicing, should that be our mandate as leaders? Not what are we fixing? And it is still not that it's wrong to fix, but what are we making? Because ultimately we have an ability to tap into the creator of the universe. So what are we creating, and what is our innovation in terms of our response to these challenges?
Wonderful. Go on, Roger. You're nodding so much, I think your head might fall off. What do you think?
That's the problem with being a psychotherapist, isn't it? You just nod all the time, and then people think you have something to say.
Do you know any psychotherapist jokes? No, don't. It's all right, Carrie.
Let's not start on those. Yeah, I sort of sit with very similar questions, really. And I guess where I'm coming at it from is sitting with the question of whether crisis in leadership is the right thing to say. It's the right question to ask, or the right way to sort of pose it. Only in the sense that it seems to me that a leader is a node in a system, really. And we have just as much a problem of followership as we have of leaders. Very often our leaders are a symptom of the cultures, the systems that produce them, and the needs and the agendas of those cultures. I also tend to view leadership as functional. So even if your name is above the door, at any given moment, you're defaulting to the expertise of other people on your team to lead you in different ways. So I feel like the crisis of leadership, really, from my point of view, is just the emergence of a larger cultural crisis that's been going on for a long time. So when I was sort of cutting my teeth in clinical psychology back in the sort of 90s, I had this sense of taking a pulse of a culture, of looking under the rug of it, really, and realizing that beneath everything was rotting and people had nowhere to turn and were lacking in hope. And I was seeing that really, and it very much felt that everything else felt like a veneer sitting on top of that we were just somehow just about managing to maintain. So sort of in 2016, with the election of, the Trump and the first Trump and all that kind of thing, people would say to me, what's going on here? And I had a feeling like we've never been rational. We've just managed to pretend for a really long time that we were. And this is just sort of some of those things manifesting. So my sort of approach to the question, increasingly, I sort of view things through the lens of character. So I'm a clinical psychologist, coach, psychotherapist. I coach and train a lot of leaders, and I look at character in two directions. One would be the sort of pathological direction, which in a sense is the sort of the heroic Moses figure that sometimes arises in leaders, which is in a sense, what's the history of our pathology? Like, what's the history of our functional inflexibility? That means when we're given power, we default to the same strategies over and over and over again, whether they work or not. And then the other side of character that I study is character strengths, which is more the sort of the naming, the defining, and the sort of assessing of interventions that produce wisdom and gratitude and compassion and empathy. And how do we do that? And sort of what I found is that in between that, this is Jason, where your sort of note on contemplation really sort of hit a nerve for me, is that I'm finding that whatever we want to call it, whether we call it mindfulness, contemplation, whether we draw it from Taoism, Stoicism, Buddhism, secular mindful practices. Personally, my sort of background is the Christian contemplative tradition of the West. But wherever we draw it from, it's that sense of being in the present moment, which on one hand sort of relaxes and de-emphasizes some of our compulsive strategies that we tend to default to. And on the other hand, increases the good elements of character, which are the sort of the thought through intentional responses. And that's my sort of model ends up with sort of trying to decrease our functional inflexibility and trying to increase our sort of intentional responsiveness. And what that requires is a very, very gentle, slow turning from one thing to the other. It almost feels it's as slow as a sort of exchange of molecules or an infinite file upload, bit by bit by bit, slowly, slowly, slowly. But every time we do it, we're building our compassion, we are building self-regulation, and we're building our ability to be curious and notice our ongoing experiencing. So I don't know if that's enough, but that seems to be the space I'm in. And it's kind of a lot of the programs that I'm running or the teaching that I'm doing is around coaching and training leaders in something that looks a little bit like that kind of awareness, whether you call it presence, whether you call it one of our programs we call Inside Out, coming to terms with the inner world, that actually very often leaders are externalizing their own pain and their own triumphs into the world. That's sort of where I've ended up thinking about it at the moment. But it feels like it's more about helping humans, some of whom end up being called leaders.
Yeah. I'm just, obviously emerging here, and we all come from a variety of backgrounds, disciplines, experiences on leadership, which makes this rich already, but the self-creating, making, how things are formed, that seems important here. And in my mind is Simon Walker's constructivist leadership approach, backstage, front stage. What connections are you making, Simon, if I could pull you in here? Because I'm thinking about your look at this point.
Thanks, Jason. Thanks, everyone. When I thought hard about leadership, it was quite a number of years ago now. I led a program in a number of theological colleges and also senior management professional organizations that came to be called the Undefended Leader Program. And I wrote a series of books on that. And I was cognizant that I had experienced myself those dysfunctional transactions between the leader and the follower that, Roger, you're talking about, and the creation of the idealized leader that Christians in particular are particularly susceptible to, having someone who lives out this idealized life. And then from that, one strategy for coping with that was to create a version of yourself that you present on the front stage and perform to the audience. And obviously that's not necessarily a healthy transaction, because you get a discrepancy between the version of yourself that's hidden behind the curtain. And often that becomes sort of unsustainable. And that was a reasonably helpful model for Christian leaders in particular, who experience themselves standing on the stage and managing the response of the audience. I'm really interested in what our communities are seeking in their leaders at the present time, because I feel like I wrote and did that work, and I haven't been doing that work for the last 13 years. I've been doing something else. So, I find myself now reflecting on where we are. And I do think that the first 20 years of the 21st century represented a sort of an era, a last era, if you like, a kind of a crumbling of a set of kind of expectations and ideas that had worked more or less for a period of time.
Right.
And now I think, the era has shifted. 2016, 2020, the pandemic, there is a whole sequence of converging factors which are, broadly speaking, creating an enormous sense of us all being out of control. We've lost control, essentially. And the levers that we pull no longer work, whether it's a political or economic level or societal level. And I compare it to kind of feeling like we're now going over a waterfall, and the movement's happening around us, and we've spent 20 years trying to sort of dam the water, but now we're going over the waterfall, and we're now cascading down. And I think for me, I'm going to hold back, Jason, from actually kind of offering what I think leaders can realistically do to perhaps later in the conversation or offer in this context. I just want to sort of acknowledge that it feels like there is a level of panic, a level of anxiety, a level of fear, and genuine unpredictability in that our circumstances are kind of almost changing month by month. That is very different from the context that I was working in before. And I think it's important to acknowledge that. I think that brings a level of realism to what, we can expect of people. And I think it makes our certainly I look back on some of my more grandiose sort of ideas of what a leader could and couldn't do, more realistic. I want to bring them down to earth. I want to be kind of kinder on people. I want to sort of, find more pragmatic ways to just, accompany people through what I genuinely feel is an unprecedentedly difficult era that we're going to find ourselves in for the next decade.
Thank you. So can I put a question to you all listening to that? What, and this tags on something that I think Roger said, what at the minute is new and emergent, or has emerged, or is emerging from our current context, and what is just who human beings are and always have been, sociologically, theologically? That question makes sense, because that speaks to me of we look back and go, well, what can we go back in the past and look at and go, yeah, we can learn from that, navigate from that, incorporate that. And what are moments when, no, there is something distinct here? And I know in particular, that's the one I've been trying to, which is harder, isn't it, to diagnose an emerging set of situations and circumstances. What do you think? Don't be shy. Or I'll have to pick on me.
Okay. I wonder if there's something, it's just something I was thinking about this morning, so this isn't particularly well thought out, but something around trust in leadership. And the thing that prompted my thinking this morning was there's just been some, I think, relatively reliable data come out of a think tank in America around trust in leadership. And it was looking particularly at business leaders, government leaders and journalists. I was thinking, well, obviously, trust's not going to be that high, but I was surprised that it was the question they posed was around fear that leaders lie to us. And across those three groups, just since 2021 till 2025, it was up sort of 11, 12 percentage points. So it was significant. And I thought, that's quite a short time to have that increase. I mean, that's obviously just one study, it was global. I wondered, that was not church leaders, but I thought it would just be interesting whether that general attitudes of distrust across all of those groups, whether it does impact on how people in congregations are viewing church leaders, and whether sort of trust erodes there, that it makes it more complex and difficult to lead.
Yeah, I mean, obviously a lot of people listening to this have been church situations, but let's consider it, broadly, because a lot of people will also be dealing with leadership issues, in the workplace, NGOs, business, and trust is certainly a currency across all aspects of the leadership world, isn't it? Good question.
I wonder, alluded to this at the very beginning of this conversation, and he talked about that old Greek word hypocritus, hypocrite, being a hypocrite. And I wonder, that's not a new word. So that's been around for a very long time. And that sense of, the mask and the pretender has been around for centuries. And I just wonder if that has been, and I'm not a psychologist, and Roger, you might correct me, but I wonder, has that just always been something that's been part of the human condition? Is that sort of always been a temptation, maybe driven by ego, which has always been around? But I suppose my question is now, because of AI and technology,
sure,
does technology enable that in a way that, or encourage it? Or does it actually just make it a little bit more accessible and, dare I say, acceptable? When we talk about celebrity influencers, and that is also in the church just as much as it is in the world, this idea of platform, leadership on a platform. And I was listening to something that I think it was Mark Sayers was talking about from his new book, from Platform to Pillars. And I just wonder, is there something about the platform media, social media in churches, physically as well as online, that actually does make it a little bit more contagious, perhaps? So I just wonder, how do we spot the pretender? If you take it like hypocrisy on that continuum, where you've got integrity on one side and you've got pure hypocrisy on the other, how do we navigate that as leaders, and how do we spot it in ourselves? That point about self-awareness, but how do we spot it in others? Or indeed, perhaps when we see some of the voting, do we even care? Or the people that don't care if you're a hypocrite? So I think it maybe touches on the integrity issue, but that's just off the top of my head, just in response to Joe.
I'll jump in on that. I was thinking when I began, my history has been church leadership for over 40 years. And we began in 1979. And the only conversation equipping formation that we got was competency-based external ways to be leaders. And I remember thinking as a very young girl at the time, I don't even remember the word leader in the church when I was growing up. This is a fairly new conversation. It was always pastor. We used spiritual conversations, spiritual terms. We never talked about leadership really in the United States until the era of who brought it on to the church was John Maxwell, and many of the conversations that he brought into church ministry, and began to teach all of us that church growth, and I could do a whole history thing from the Jesus Revolution that happened in our era when we began pastoring, and how the church growth movement really was a way of capturing what was taking place in this Jesus Revolution, and I would say systematize it, establish it. And so church growth and leadership went hand in hand. And I remember that's the only thing we were trained in. I never heard anything about spiritual formation, the inner life of the leader, the person of the leader. That was nowhere on our conversation. And I look at this and in the role of leadership that I've had, and I've had to clean up a lot of what's been broken leadership. And when you've had to do that enough, you begin to look at and diagnose what is really the issue here. And the truth is, all the competency in the world will not withstand the pressures of leadership. There is not enough competency-based teaching anywhere around to help people stand up, especially in this current moment. If there is not the pillar on the inside, as Mark is talking about, if there is not that inner life, and I would say even spiritual formation does not entail all that is needed. Very much the emotional, the holistic development of the human, the Jesus human that needs to be developed from that moment that you become the pillar on the inside. Then really whatever happens on the outside, we have no control over anyway. I think it's always been a misnomer that we think we could control anything. So it's that internal, that development of the human that makes us really resilient through whatever comes on the outside. But if all you have is outward competency training and formation, I am convinced that's why we're seeing so much of the meltdown, the burnout, the I don't want to do this anymore, a young generation not interested in it anymore because that's what they've experienced as leadership.
I wondered, Tammy, as well, as you said that, it reminded me of something else that is quite critical to this, is how we measure success, if success is the right word to use. And I remember reading a Dallas Willard article a number of years ago around the wrong success measures. And certainly from my research, from my denomination, Assemblies of God in the UK, quite a lot of the formation of that movement was around growth. It was around numbers. It was around all these other things. And also baptism of the Spirit, speaking in tongues, but they were all very external, outward-facing things. And that sort of leads to a certain view of what is needed in order for leaders to be successful. And more recently, the thing that I've been grappling with is that often we don't look for leaders who are humble. We don't always look for leaders who sort of show that depth and breadth of character that goes alongside gifting. We're not always thinking about the fruit of the Spirit, although we quite often look at the gifts of the Spirit. So I really feel that sense of what are the wrong measures and what are the sort of things, and measures is possibly the wrong word, but what are the sort of indicators that we should be thinking about when we think about that holistic leadership context, and context is massively important.
Jason, even your context, because we certainly want to, Portland Seminary, we're talking about beyond church leadership, but Christian leaders, wherever they are found. And even what do they describe as success? I think this is the shift that we have to bring to leadership in general, is what do we define? What are our metrics, so to speak, even in corporate business leaders, in every sector of society?
I'm really interested to hear what people feel about this, the perceived value of integrity or authenticity. Let's use the word integrity. So, I'm hearing you talking about, the recognition that ultimately leadership becomes dysfunctional and unsustainable if it's just an expert performance or highly skilled, but doesn't have that formation spiritual, emotional, etc., etc. And for me, I felt that that was an argument that was quite well won 15, 20 years ago. The cohesion of that was quite well established. And I thought that the church was kind of, certainly in the UK and the Anglican world where I was kind of participating, we didn't have to fight on that ground. And there were lots of good programs in the kind of seminaries I was involved in that were investing in that, and saw that leadership started with that kind of process of maturing internally, and the external was just kind of outflowing of that. Yes, you needed to work on some skills and techniques, etc., knowledge, but came from there. But maybe I'm just feeling rather cynical and a little bit anxious, and maybe I'm wanting some reassurance from you that not all has been lost, because it's felt like the water's been running away from that agenda over the last 10 years. I haven't had a lot to do with the church. I need to say that I largely participate in work outside in industry, education. So I may just be out of touch, but, I take what's going on with Trump as an indicator that there is a sort of appetite for raw power now, a kind of willingness to accept a division between the moral person and what they can actually do and what they do with their fiat power for us. And it feels to me like this is a consequence of the kind of feeling of powerlessness that people feel in society. So much is out of their control. And when we're powerless, we look for someone powerful to come and resolve things for us. So it feels like it's a consequence of a sort of dehumanizing degradation of our society, a kind of experience of ourselves as more out of control, which makes us vulnerable to leaders who promise and execute a kind of power on our behalf to do things, even if it is a form of aggression and violence, ultimately. And we're certainly seeing the wider population, I think, embracing that, both in the UK and in the West, across Europe and in America. I wonder whether you're seeing that in the church. As I say, I ask that because I don't have really any experience of the church.
Yeah.
Whether
Simon,
there's the same tainting going on.
I would say in America, and again, this is my main context. I loved hearing you talk about the marriage happening 15 years ago, but I would say that's not the case in America. I don't think that it did take root. I think there was a strong movement toward it, and certainly Dallas and Richard Foster and others who have worked very hard, including our own seminary. But if you look at the evangelicals who really were the ones that we see in the news that are very much a part of this power movement, you don't find that either in their seminaries, or they're mostly in churches who do not value seminary. So their pastors have not even been trained in anything like that. So their training comes in a very different way. And so I think, I hate to discourage you, and I'm sorry about that, but I would say broadly, that has not taken hold in America.
And I would go a little bit further, Simon, in my context of initially commercial and then higher education, as well as the church. What we've noticed around the crises in higher education funding and what universities are going through in the UK is almost a reversion. So I think there was a conversation about the sorts of leadership. I don't think it was a very strong conversation at times, but at least there started to be an agenda. And then about 5 or 6, maybe a bit longer years ago, as financial pressures happened, political sort of changes happened, legislation changes happened around student visas and other things. Lots of the external context created great pressure. And what I saw in my context was a reversion to command and control, and a reversion to those sort of things that sort of make you feel as though, well, what was all that discussion and sort of knowledge around how we should treat people, how people should sort of work together, the collaborative elements. What we're seeing now, and Chris and I have seen this on one of our programs, I've seen it on another one more recently, is that sense of leaders feeling very disconnected from each other in the same organisation, where organisations are increasingly sort of complex. Leaders, possibly because of the hybrid situation, possibly through other situations, are not connecting in the way that maybe they used to. And there's a more sense of isolation. And as we bring these are senior strategic leaders working for the same organisation together, one of the biggest values that they get from our sort of day-long programs is the opportunity to talk together about key issues and to sense that they're not in this alone, that other people are feeling the same way, and that there's an opportunity for collective power, which, as you said, Simon, that sort of speaks to that sense of feeling powerless and done to rather than done with.
Can I just say, if anyone, in addition to Simon Walker, is feeling psychologically anxious, we could all switch our cameras off, apart from Roger, and he could make an intervention. That would be kind of fun to listen to as well. So thanks, Will. Can I just jump in? What a fascinating conversation we're having. I came into leadership when I was 19 years old and 55. Just thinking of things that I've observed broadly. Simon Walker, you shared something with my doctoral students about servant leadership. That was a thing a while ago and seems to have died a death. And I think there was a drive for servant leadership, but what it often meant was servant leadership meant caring for people and not getting stuff done. And then we moved into this incredibly pragmatic environment of success, numbers, resources. And in the church world, what that meant with a broadly consumerist mentality in a pretty still is a settled post-World War, liberal settlement of actually most people thought, yeah, I believe some of this stuff. I'm going to subcontract it out to the leaders, and I hope that they do the stuff I don't want to do because I'm busy making a life and earning money and going on holiday and making my investment portfolios and building my business and getting my exit plan. And that's been happening. And I think the relationship that you've been talking about between power and identity was there, and a willingness to move, either in America, move towards it, or in certain environments in the UK, other denominations and churches may be much closer to that. But with what's happened since, I don't know, we trace this from 9/11 onwards, the death of liberal democracies running their course and the liberal settlement ending, and what do human beings do psychologically? Revert to type. And I'm hearing here that under immense pressure, we will hold on to everything we've got with all we can. And unsurprisingly, that's why younger generations statistically are saying, I really don't care if I have an autocratic oligarch running the country, unelected, as long as I can still do all the things I like to do economically, or reversions to socialism, or some of these other things that we're looking for. And quick fixes to a world, and again, that's the article that I sent you, that is now deeply steeped in the affective and psychological identity and reality. So it doesn't surprise me that Edwin Friedman, writing his book so long ago now, that idea of being a non-anxious presence has become a common phrase people use. But we still don't know what that means or the work it takes to be a non-anxious presence who doesn't have false attachments or disabling attachments. That's just trying to pull some of these threads together. Can I pull in Simon Weston here? Yeah. Simon, what have you been thinking?
Too much. I've been a bit overwhelmed. Too many thoughts. I mean, firstly, to say that, like, we talk about leadership and we often just reduce this down to the individual again. And we now, I'm a psychoanalyst. I'm a therapist as well as Roger, and that work's important work. Understanding the projections you get as a leader and that working through them. This is really important work. But for me, it's not leadership. It's like leadership is we forget the ship. We forget the kind of the beyond the individual. And what I've been thinking is, the question is kind of what's really changed. Well, what's really changed is we're facing an environmental emergency, a climate crisis, which means that the world is probably not going to get better. This is a reality. We're facing a reality where we're now entering what I call a precarious interdependent age. We're going to be living in precarity for a long time, and some people are going to be living in desperate precarity. I've been working in the humanitarian field for the last 2 years, and you see it visibly. But with technological disruption, with environmental disruptions, we're living in times of precarious times, and we have to adjust to living in times of precarity, which is beyond the American dream. The American dream of the next generation will always be better is unlikely to happen. We're in trouble. And I think that changes things, So you've got these kind of big forces of technology and the environment. And the question is, we can do mindfulness, we can do psychological safety, we can do lots of different things to support individuals. But what kind of leadership is needed in the precarious interdependent age? This is a question we're facing, and I think Pope Francis is onto something with his synodal leadership. I've been working in the Catholic Church in Rome, supporting the synodal process. There's something important there around where you stop looking at a heroic, charismatic Messiah leader, and you say, no, the lay people can be leaders as well. The women can be leaders as well. The marginalised Indigenous communities can show leadership. And this is part of my work in eco-leadership, where we think about leadership from the edges. This is where change really comes. The social movements have always shown that change comes from the edges. So it's encouraging this idea that leadership's not just situated in the bishop or the priest or the Messiah. I think individual agency is important. I think we do have some very special leaders now and again. We had one recently, Marion Budd, spoke up, the Bishop of New York. She's that kind of leadership is courageous, it's needed, it's powerful. I value that. But really, leadership is beyond that. And when we think about leadership formation, I think there's a model in the church which we ignore, and it's monastic formation.
Right.
To be formed as a monk, you don't get trained as a monk. You don't do monk skills. You don't go on a monk learning program. You get formed by the community. You get formed by prayer. You get formed by the life of being a monk in that holistic community. And leadership moves between people in that community. I think that's a valuable kind of way to think about how we can open up spaces and create spaces where leadership can emerge, rather than selecting individuals and doing, you're the high potentials, you're the next generation. Leadership emerges in some very unusual places. And if we look at it more openly than just kind of thinking about kind of an individual in a position of power, it's my work in eco-leadership is really, it always stuns me and astounds me that if you sit in a group and you allow leadership to emerge, where that leadership voice comes from. So it's about creating spaces, and I think the monastic formation is a good model, and synodal leadership is a good model to help us think a bit more about that. So that's what I've been thinking about.
Thanks, Simon. If I can jump back in straight away with, can Advanced HE do a monastic skills course? I wonder if you could sell that. That modality reminds me of an apprenticeship model, which immediately makes me think, how do we deal with the issue of, because I think what we have had, there has been a move of apprenticeship models of leadership and people talking about it, and I won't name certain church movements that have done that, because some have done it well, and the intentions well. But if you apprentice yourself to someone who's got, an unresolved shadow, sociopathy, psychology, what, I guess I'll turn that into a question. What are there guardrails? How do you get good monastic-like formation? Do you have to, that's the question.
I mean, just to respond, I don't think it is an apprenticeship model.
Okay.
I think that's different. I think, that might be part of it. It's being formed by the life, what the monks call the life.
The life.
And the life is a holistic way of being. It's a rhythm of the life. It's a prayer rhythm. The work you do, the manual labor you do. It's the being part of a community. It's the spiritual direction. It's the scriptures. It's the psalms being repeated. So it's the life. It's not like getting attached to just one person and getting spiritual direction. It's much more than that. So how can we create communities in our workplaces, in our churches, which can help form people and allow leadership to kind of emerge in those spaces? So I think that's what I'm kind of like. I work in banks. I work in manufacturing plants, and I'm always talking to them about creating spaces where leadership can emerge.
And is that a mutuality? Where do you see the opportunity for mutuality? Again, I'm mindful of the other Simon here, previous conversation. What kind of communities form healthy leaders, and what kind of leaders help form healthy communities in mutuality with each other? How does
I don't know if the other Simon wants to respond, but I suppose
Go first.
is that okay? Ladies first. I know that I'm a lady, but anyway, I think from what I'm reminded of. So I'm part of the Vineyard movement, so UK Ireland Vineyard. So I have been a trustee on a board where we have just had a major leadership crisis on the North Coast, Causeway Coast Vineyard. And so we've been wrestling with this question because we've had a highly effective, competent leader, and we have had a lot of, if you want to use, in my view, false proxy in terms of numbers and growth. But that ultimately is not sustainable. I truly believe in my heart, it's not from a research perspective in my heart, but in light of what we face at the minute, when you talk about technology and climate or in the environment and these challenges that we face, never mind the onslaught of the anti-Christian world that is emerging, is that we need leaders with those practices of prayer, spiritual formation. We need the inner work, to me, has to be the focus, just following for what Tammy. So we asked our congregation, so we had 18 months with no senior pastor. And we brought our congregation on the journey, and we asked them, what do we as a community want in a leader? I was personally fascinated. I thought this was the best social experiment. And we give them, of course, like 5 different options. And it's still really interesting where people like really good teacher of the word. So it's like, oh wow, so somebody can pretend to do that. Somebody could put on the show, and then you get all of this. But actually, whenever we were selecting and going through that process, you can imagine as a leadership scholar and someone that research, I'm just totally fascinated by this, and I'm not theologically trained, so I'm sorry if I offend anybody in their theology. You can correct me later, Jason, but I think for me, we mentioned something there about apprenticeship or practices, and actually who we have now is we chose a female leader. It's the first time for the Vineyard movement in the UK, Ireland to have a female senior pastor. She is married, but not a couple that were married into the role. And I feel like it was not I can't say that was a really easy call for us. She was absolutely the right candidate for all of those reasons. But even that leadership from the edges comes with we're in Northern Ireland, so I would say probably even more traditional and conservative. But what we saw in her was, number one, was calling. Not I'm called, but in a complete and utter conviction from her heart. And we had lots of ways of testing that and exploring that. Was number one, calling. Number 2, character, but do you really know? In a couple of interviews or conversations, do you really know? And I suppose the do you really know leads me to the apprentice, what you said, Jason, because actually we chose someone who was outside our movement. And we chose someone from a different sort of like group of churches. And she came under like an apprentice, that's not the word, with leaders in a movement and really grew up and was spiritually formed. She's also a spiritual director and she's an executive coach. I just find it really interesting that even in a pastoral calling apostolic ministry, that there is that sense of the whole person and understanding the spiritual direction. Yes, theologically trained and knows the word of God, but actually there was a deep, deep understanding of inner work. And I think that's what really struck me. She's only 3 weeks into the role, and really interesting to see how she's handling conversations and how she's questioning. And the first thing she said is, which I actually felt very emotional about, and she said, "We are not running. We're going to slow it all down." I was delighted because it's been a very long run. So I definitely feel there's something in the slowness away. I'm sorry, I'm probably talking too much, but it's just so live for me right now.
That prompts me, and then I want to ask Joe a question, I think. One of the things I've noticed in the article I sent you guys before we met today, that we've got competences and skills with this emergence on resilience and willpower and grit, and we can't out-competence the problems of our leadership crisis. We can't out-resilience ourselves. People are trying to be as resilient as they can, are still blowing up. So there is this, and there's something that we're all touching on here today. There is a formational piece, a deep piece to identity in many ways that we're all seem to be touching on. And also that we've known that for a while. And yet it's like it's always been over there please make sure you deal with your stuff and sort yourself out with God. And then there's all the usual stuff Simon will give, front stage of getting stuff done. How do those two places come together and get integrated? And I hear Carice saying you're seeing an example of that. Someone who's theologically trained and a coach and, mentoring. So my question after all of that, so Joe behind the scenes interviews a lot of people in pretty high powered roles, and you delve really deeply into their backstage, don't you? How have you seen how that stuff over here, you can't see my hand, I don't think, it's over here, and this one over here, how those worlds come together? What's that look like in your experience?
That's a good question. Yeah, I do. I deal with a lot of senior leaders, and probably more so outside the church, ambassadors to various countries and people like that. I am really, and there's just something so powerful about self-awareness. And so, and that's what I'll be exploring with them in an assessment context. And I'm just blown away by some people who are particularly, I don't know, see like French ambassadors to France, it's a massive position. So they're all current ambassadors. So they're all, they've got the proficiency, like they perform very effectively, on the stage and on what they're doing in their roles. But some of the individuals I assess, and when I use like a dark side tool as well, I mean, some are so humble and self-aware, and you just, it gives me such confidence in their leadership. They're able to, talk to the areas that, even in an assessment context where you think this is the time you want to mask, and some will just, say, I can be really overly dominant in this context. I really watch this. This is what I do. It's just very self-aware, and others just have no concept of how they might be coming across. I'm experiencing them as well, so it's not just from their psychometrics, it's how they're showing up in the space with me. I think a lot does come down to self-awareness in terms of how you bring it together. Can I pick up, slightly change subject, to pick up on something Will said? It really resonated well when you were talking about the program and how even within the denomination people are feeling so isolated, and how this is just such a good opportunity to talk. When I've been thinking about this whole topic, particularly since you sent the email, Jason, and reading your article, and where I got to, and I normally go down the leadership derailment path when I'm thinking about leadership crisis, because I'm so interested in that. But this time I kind of went down quite a sort of psychology 101 model that just kept coming back into my head, which is the job demands control model. And then later they had support. And so I was just thinking about leadership in that context, like church leadership, and how demands are so... demands feel increasing, like particularly cognitively, because it's so complex, as we talked about, and like we said about, we're going the grey area, like Mark Sayers talks about grey zone, and there's increasing complexity and demand, and from congregations who are more consumerism and sort of demanding potentially, and then the control piece that Simon you picked up on, there's that sort of, so high demand, low control is a sort of formula for burnout and stress, and so you've got that just low, I think an increasingly low level of control with just the environment as it is. And so there, that's where I was just like, gosh, social support from just studies in different areas is such a buffer, like in those sort of situations. And then I was thinking about that church leader role. You're often just, plucked from somewhere and put somewhere else, or you're called places, or in the Church of England, you could be just sent somewhere completely rural where you know no one. It's fairly common in churches. So you're taken out of your social support network, and you don't necessarily even know people within your own denominational network. So I was just wondering, whether there's something really there around sort of peer mentoring, and then just individually to do some of that formational work, self-awareness, sort of dealing with your dark side, so sort of spiritual direction, coaching. I was just thinking how powerful perhaps those social support aspects might be.
Lots of nodding going on. What are people saying?
Yeah, I did put in the chat, but when Simon Weston was talking about the monastic formation, one of the things that has significantly shifted in answer to your earlier question, Jason, maybe is what's happened with community, and particularly sort of the move from agrarian to industrial in the UK, to industrial to then sort of digital, the fourth industrial revolution, all that sort of stuff. And the sense of isolation and loneliness and disconnectedness and less sticky communities maybe than what existed before. And that sort of just linking in what Simon said to what Joe just said as well, and that real desire for sort of having authentic relationships and community, but not having the same context that perhaps we've been used to as humans for hundreds of years.
To pick up on that, well, another thing I was thinking about was I don't think we should underestimate the amount of disenchantment in the world. Like, even in the secular world, people are disenchanted, they're alienated, they're turning to many different kind of whether it's drugs or binging TV or excess to kind of fill up the lack that they're feeling. But also in the churches, there's a disenchantment, and it can be projected onto the leaders, it can be projected in different ways, but there's a generalized kind of disenchantment. And I think that the huge task for leadership today is re-enchantment. I think fundamentally, you won't get any change, you won't get any kind of a real change in the churches, in our work, unless we can find ways to re-enchant our communities. I think that's the task of leadership today.
Can you say some more on that, Simon? Because I understand what you mean, but for people listening, it's such a rich word, enchantment, disenchantment. What?
Yeah, I mean, it follows Charles Taylor's kind of work around analysing the move from the pre-modern to the modern. The pre-modern world was an enchanted world. Everything was imbued with the spirit. The indigenous communities kind of had that idea. And the early Christian church, has it as well. It's within Christianity, the tradition that the spirit is alive with us. I think that's been, of course, in secular society, that's, modernity has kind of crushed that in many ways. That's a huge kind of problem. But also in the churches, I think we've lost the aliveness of the spirit in a way. And I'm not just talking about an evangelical tradition versus a Catholic tradition or tradition. The spirit manifests in many different kind of ways. But I think, we have to kind of put that right central again in our work and in our communities. I'm not expecting a charismatic leader to come and kind of just enlighten the community. It's not like a top-down thing. It's very much sort of a bottom-up, that how can we, in every interaction, kind of look for where that spirit is and find that re-enchantment again. And I really think that's a task of leadership today.
Jason, that triggers a thought for me. Of course, you've had us read all of those books in the program, including Simon's, and I am very much, in fact, Simon, that's when my whole mindset about leader versus leadership really adjusted around that. And, I have been thinking about, ever since we've discussed this, Jason, on this civilization level disruption, that we see God create out of chaos. And, I live in the middle of the United States, so I am embedded in all that's going on here right now. And I will tell you that there is a sense in the nation that some see that we have a savior. Others are saying chaos has just begun. And so with 350 executive orders already being signed and turning things upside down, I've actually had this growing hope. I'm just going to say, we use the word crisis. I believe it's a crisis, but I just find God does his most creative work out of chaos. And maybe when things are orderly, and we think we have leadership down and we have everything under control, that we basically are doing the work ourselves instead of the God of the universe doing it. And I am absolutely not disturbed. I'm really not, because I actually find I love to read history. I remind my children all the time who are in their 40s that the world has been just as disruptive. I could tell you when I was a little girl, sitting in front of the television, watching what was going on in the politics and in the world, and hearing my parents talk very much like we are talking today. We have been here in some of these ways before. Yes, it's a different season in some, but I just have this growing sense of hope that the chaos is actually important to what needs to happen in real leadership. And that's why I talk about the strength of the inner person, the human development, the growth of true Christ-like, the human Christ-like side of Christians. And I will say in America, we dismally failed in the area of forming people. We were all about conversion growth, and then we just left people. And so I have said often, I see the shallowness of the church in America is really a lack of Christian formation after conversion. And so we're acting out of a very shallow way of Christian faith. And then our theology informs that. So I want to say, as you know, I know we don't have a whole lot of time, Jason, but I think having a hope story that chaos is actually a part of all of this. And it probably will even get more chaotic, especially here. I mean, we're just all bracing for it. And yet at the same time, that is where God does the most creative things and calls it very good. So I just had that growing sense of wanting to bring that back.
Can I follow on from that, Tammy, and resonate with it? The sense that crisis means opportunity, doesn't it? And a moment or time of opportunity. And that there's if you're right, and this is a moment of chaotic opportunity, it's likely to be happening outside the church, in places that we're not normally paying attention to, and certainly not part of our existing tribe. So I wonder whether part of the task of being leadership at the moment is to be brave enough to move ourselves out, to listen to what's going on out there that's sort of messy and emergent. We had a funny thing happen in our local church in our town, which has been a beautiful, incredible building, and it's had a very sterile, dry, dead last 15 years. Tired Anglican leader here who left, and the new vicar arrived and said, "Well, I'd love to, it was just before Christmas, let's do some community carols." About 15 people come to a carol service at this church. It's a town of 14,000. It's got no spiritual energy at all. And so they just got this word out on Facebook, and over 500 people poured into the building for this, most of whom had never been into that church before. And it was just one of those things that made you think there is appetite, there is hunger, there's longing, and what were they coming for? They were coming to sing some familiar carols in a time of chaos and uncertainty. They wanted to be grounded. They wanted to be together with other people. Kind of some fairly ordinary, basic stuff, which, you just wonder how much of that need is around us in our communities, and where are people gathering to find it? And, I wonder whether Christian leaders could be brave enough to get out and join in with what's going on and listen and serve and then amplify and support and be humble enough to say that this kind of regrowing of what it means to be human and human community, which is really what we're talking about, needing to re-find, may start outside and may be led by other people, and we may do nothing more than join in and try to support it. And boy, I've certainly learned that some of the things we're talking about around formation and the kind of monastic discipline of life and a rule of life and a rhythm of life, I've witnessed more people outside the church learning those disciplines and living out those practices themselves from different traditions than the church over the last 15 years. Sometimes I think we're just trying to catch up with where the Spirit is. Yeah.
Well, looking at the time, why don't we land on this in this way? We've segued nicely into the spiritual dimension, explicitly Christian modality of leadership. And just maybe we'll just round out with some thoughts of what we think press into this to finish, what faith and leadership. So this idea of enchantment, the Spirit, what God is doing, if we believe that God is sovereign, salvation history, working from the margins, getting the church to go where, it's always been like that. It never wanted to leave Jerusalem. So God used persecution to move it. So all of those things we know are true. So I'll land on my one thing I hold on to that keeps me anchored in the storm. Oliver O'Donovan, the Christian ethicist, very well-known ethicist, reading his books really inspired me, and in terms of a theology of leadership for me. And he said that what God does in Christ is not the disempowerment of the Roman Empire, which is what people wanted. Come and be a king. Come and take charge. Come and kill. Come and put things right. Instead, in Christ, he makes it possible for every Christian to disarm and have disempowered everything that would stop them living for the King of Kings. and the sovereignty of God. Very different. Whatever we are and I took away from that, whatever we are facing, it's not, what do I fix? How do I resolve it? How do I make it better? All those other, there's all the measures. And I think we've touched on today, there's lots of really good measures. We want to move things and have impact. That's all great. But the things that are coming at me the most, in Christ, by the Holy Spirit, God can empower me, and especially as a leader, to be faithful to God as my King and my Lord and my Savior. Does that make sense? Well, it's sort of, it's a different way for me to look at leadership and be enchanted. What about you guys?
I'll pick up a little bit on that, if that's okay, Jason, just sort of riff off what you've said. I think for me, if the greatest occupation of a leader who's leading an organisation should be around understanding how their organisational culture is shaped and how it shapes them, then I think the greatest occupation for a leader in the ministerial sense should be nothing more or less than their fellowship of Jesus. And I think that's where perhaps things have gone a little bit off kilter in terms of not having that as the first and foremost occupation. And that's not necessarily blaming the individual leader's fault. It's about the system, it's about the structure, it's about the expectations that others have on that pastor, Tammy. That sense of, pastor was the only designation that we used in AOG from 1924, and we certainly weren't talking about leadership until more recently. And there's a bit of a schism between ministry and leadership, and that sense that the resolution of this is all about how closely and nearly and dearly we as leaders are first and foremost following Jesus and being conformed into Christ's image.
I think for me, I remember a conversation. A lot happens around conversations, right? Especially as leaders. And it was with someone who was in their mid-80s, and it was last April. And he said to me, Carice, how are you in the middle of this leadership crisis? And of course, I was like, well, just hanging in there, the usual. And I just said to him, it's like everything's been like taken and it's just been upside down. And he just looked at me and he just said to me, maybe God's turning it the right way up. So I felt like something stuck with me in my heart, that actually when I hear some of the monastic practices, the inner work, the backstage work, all of these things tell me, and to believe it with hope, like Tammy said, he's actually turning it the right way up, because he's coming back for his bride. And it's not a topsy-turvy bride, he's coming back for a bride. So that's where I go. I
was also really touched by the sort of monastic element of things. And I think if there's one thing that sort of really sticks for me, it's the idea that Ronald Rolheiser has in his book, Domestic Monastery, where he talks about the monk who went off into the desert. And when he comes back from the desert back to France and meets his mum, he realizes that she's become more holy than he has. And he's trying to work out what's going on. And he said he realized that every demand that she's faced, whether it's children, grandchildren, things to be done, house to be tidied, whatever, for her, that was the ringing of the monastery bell. It was God saying, and here's your next thing, and here's your next thing. And I think for me, that's the kind of sense of finding the two hands of God. Yes, God rising up within us by his presence, but also as meeting God coming to us through every test, every trial, every temptation. And those are the things that are the shadow behind which the power of the purposes of God lie for us. And so for me, it's that sense of, bringing some of that monastic element back into life. And that's where some of the enchantment lies, is that God is rushing to meet us. We're not just bringing something out into the world.
Awesome.
A phrase that I have been just living in the last few days that I have read recently is, when someone spends time with you, could they say they've had a brush with the holy? And that's what's been resonating in me, is if every follower of Jesus, no matter their title in or out of the church, is truly being formed as those who walk with following the ways of Christ, being transformed into the person of Christ. As we go into the world, this is where leadership happens, and it happens in various ways and forms by various people. Because when someone would say, I feel like as if I've brushed against the holy because they've had coffee with us, I don't know any greater leadership than that. And I think just that moment to recognize This is what Christianity has been called to. And so are we people who others brush against the holy.
Any final thoughts for anyone?
Simon, I think you're muted.
Yeah, silenced in my silent cloister. I work with a lot of leaders, and a piece of work I do, and I think this is what I want to leave the audience with, is the idea of locating ourselves in a dislocated world. And to locate ourselves, I think, is to feel grounded and to feel whole again. And to feel whole is to feel holy. It's beyond the human. I think we need to get this. Re-Enchantment is about being part of a cosmos, Christian cosmos, a spiritual cosmos, but beyond ourselves, a world which transcends the material. And I think this is what's lost. So to locate ourselves in our rightful place, and each one of us, that place will be different, but helping our leaders, our brothers, helping and loving our neighbours, and that the neighbour will be human and non-human. It will be nature around us, but locating ourselves in our places and becoming whole again is what I want to leave you with.
Well, okay. God, Simon, last one.
Is there time?
Yeah, we've got time. I thought you'd all finished, so I was just going to go, hey.
This idea of enchantment, there's some interesting stuff being written about the value or contribution that awe makes to our humanity and how that changes us. Being in awe, and awe isn't just a mountaintop experience, it's also the moment of seeing some intimate, private, small encounter or everyday event that stops us and makes us see the other as wonderful. And of course, all technology these days, almost all of it, crushes awe out of our world, and it reduces the moment down to a transaction, and it then robs us of that moment. And so our attention is absorbed, and we put ourselves in the center of our world rather than looking out. We take selfies rather than looking in awe of the world. So whether that movement, whether we learn, because we're all having to resist that effect of technology, aren't we? Ourselves, and my wife tells me that I'm terrible with my phone. So that's a new part of personal formation that we've got to, as an act of resistance, to bring ourselves into the world, as you're saying, Simon, in a posture of awe and attention, where we can be re-enchanted by how the world gives itself to us, and God gives himself to us through that attention. And we risk missing that eternal moment, that bright field that R.S. Thomas talks about, where God is present in that moment of awe. So, yeah, that's going to be what I'm trying to do in 2025 as a person, and possibly that will help me lead others a little more truly as a result.
Thank you. Oh my goodness. So God is sovereign. The Spirit is at work from the margins. And we have some things that we are trying to recover that were inherent to our faith and tradition for 2,000 years that we need to integrate into leadership, and find ways to do that together that see other people encouraged and formed into enchantment and encounter with God, that at the same time allows us to get things done, to move things as leaders and make the world a better place. Those are some of my immediate takeaways from you. Thank you all for your time and your thoughts. It's been wonderful to have you here. And for those of you listening, as I said, there'll be, I think, what do they say? That I wish I was down with all the kids that know how to do this. There's show notes at the end of the recording with links to everyone and everything. So thanks for being here again. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Jim.